Hello, class, and welcome to Lesson 6. Today, we're focusing on medieval French literature, and specifically the epic poem Song of Roland, which is considered the national epic of France. Just want to review a little bit of what we've learned so far about the Middle Ages, some specific points about the Middle Ages that are crucial to understanding this poem. We talked a little bit about the Crusades, which played a central role. We primarily talked about them so far when we were covering the background on the Middle Ages. Oftentimes, the Crusades are the event that, for many scholars, critics, historians, defines this time period because they illustrate the conflict between Europe and the Middle East, so the West and the East, and subsequently between Christianity and Islam. And for many, when they think of the Middle Ages, that conflict between West and East, Christianity and Islam is the conflict that drives this time period. As we talked about before, in addition to conflict, there was also a lot of collaboration, sharing of stories. So as we go back and we look at these texts in more depth from this time period, we should look for nuances that reveal more than just what has been commonly known for years about the Crusades. However, with that said, Song of Roland is very much a text that helps perpetuate the popular understanding of the Crusades in the Middle Ages as a time of conflict. It's one of the texts that scholars look to as they've defined the Middle Ages that way. So it's a text that's driven by conflict, probably more than any of the other texts we'll look at from the Middle Ages. But it plays a very important historical role in terms of showing how the Crusades influenced the development, the emergence of Western civilization and Western literature. When we studied the 1001 Nights, we talked about the vizier's allegiance to the king, how he was, willing to just go execute a different woman each morning for the king. That loyalty that you see there was very much a hallmark of the Middle Ages for a number of cultures, both East and West, and is an example of how, despite these conflicts, despite these crusades, despite these perceived religious differences, the Middle Ages really was marked by overlap between East and West, Christianity and Islam. And so that loyalty, we saw that, the way the vizier has pledged himself to the king is something we see all throughout the Middle Ages, but particularly in Song of Roland. While it was kind of a minor element in the 1001 Nights, since the main focus of that text is Scheherazad's relationship to the king, rather than her father's relationship to the king, here in Song of Roland is the central element, the driving force of the text. Song of Roland can also be considered an imperialist text. Think back to when we studied the Aeneid in Roman literature and how Augustus commissioned Virgil to compose the Aeneid, and how in many ways it furthered the imperialistic mission of Rome. Now, it was a complicated text, so at times it also questioned the imperialism of Rome, especially when we see the fall of Troy or Dido's tragic fate in Carthage, which was one of the places that Rome conquered. But think back to that text and think back to how we defined imperialism as the conquering of another country through military as well as ideological means. Song of Roland, like the Aeneid, can very much be considered an imperialist text. In fact, you might even say that Song of Roland has a less complicated relationship to imperialism and is just very much a pro-imperialist text. With that said, it reveals much about the relationships of the time period and much about medieval thought. It's a great text to give us a way into understanding how Europeans thought and acted, what they believed about justice during the medieval period. Europeans more so than people from the Middle East or the East or Islam. We studied that more so in the lesson on 1001 Nights in Rumi. It's also important to take into consideration, this discussion of imperialism came up a little bit with 1001 Nights, that imperialism wasn't just conducted through military means. We see it depicted in the text in these battles, but the text itself could also be a tool of the colonizer. I mentioned a few minutes ago that imperialism was often conducted ideologically as well as through the use of the military. And so literature, language, those things could actually be tools of the colonizer. Imperialism also involves rooting out the pre-existing culture and replacing it with the culture of the colonizers to make the local inhabitants assimilate and become more like the colonizers. And so literature can play a significant role in that. We talked during the 1001 Nights lecture about how that text was used in this way throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. We read a very good recent 21st century translation of 1001 Nights, but in the 18th and 19th, maybe even 17th centuries as well, many European translations of the 1001 Nights helped further the imperial mission of Europe, who was colonizing parts of the East and the Middle East and wanted Easterners to be depicted in a certain way. And many European texts from those centuries translations of it play up the sexuality even more so than is already present and exoticize the East in a way that would kind of justify imperialism. You see something similar in the Song of Roland with the depictions of Muslims, which are very one-dimensional. Clearly, the Western Christian characters here are more complex, more multifaceted characters, and so those one-dimensional portrayals of the Muslims, the Saracen Muslims in the text, further the imperialist mission by depicting them in one way without depth, without treating them as real human beings, and in a way that furthers the imperial mission. So that's yet another thing we'll explore with this text. Some background on the text itself. It was composed in the 11th century CE, but it depicts events from an actual battle that did really take place in the 8th century BCE. So it's a text that straddles the divide between past and present and engages with both. The audience at the time would have been the Anglo-Norman elite who lived in England, France, after the Norman conquest of 1066. After the Norman conquest of 1066, different tribes started to come together in England and France and form into actual nations, including in France specifically the Frankish tribe, which is the tribe we see doing battle in Song of Roland. And so Song of Roland was composed around this time as the French nation was emerging, and much like the Aeneid, is the kind of epic poem that is tied to the development of a nation. Because it depicts the end of a series of very successful campaigns for the Franks in the 8th century, and also encapsulates so many of the medieval values that we've talked about so far, and we'll explore more in a few minutes. It became tied to the emergence of the French nation and is still considered the national epic of France. An interesting aspect, and this again makes it a very French, national epic of France kind of text, is it was written in French vernacular. As we talked about in our introduction to the medieval period, many countries spoke the same couple of languages at this time, and that made those languages universal languages. In the West, the universal language was Latin, and in the East, the universal language was Arabic. And what that did was, if a text was written in, say, Latin or Arabic, that made it so people from multiple countries could read that text, and that was the benefit of a universal language. But as the Middle Ages move on, and then later in the Renaissance, you see it more when we study the Renaissance texts, in a couple of weeks. Vernacular language, and vernacular is kind of a binary to universal here, means a local specific language spoken mainly by one tribe or country rather than a universal language spoken by multiple groups. You see late medieval, early Renaissance period, the rise of vernacular language and kind of the fading out of universal languages. And Song of Roland is one of the first examples. In the 11th century, it's one of the first major literary texts we still study today that is not written in Latin or Arabic, after the rise of Latin. So that's a pretty significant fact about this text. And then a little bit more before we look at the text in depth, returning to the discussion of how this text straddles past and present. You have the 8th century when it takes place, the 11th century when it was written. Keep those two dates in mind. During the 8th century, Charlemagne was leading the Franks and leading them successfully in battle, so they were victorious in a number of campaigns in Spain. Now, Charlemagne is a really significant figure both historically and in literature. He was king of the Franks, but he was so successful, he eventually became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the West. Remember we talked about earlier in our introduction to the medieval period how after the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century CE, the Holy Roman Empire emerged, which was Christian rather than polytheistic. And it had a seat in the West at Rome and a seat in the East in Constantinople. And different emperors in each of those regions as well, because it stretched so far. So Charlemagne started out as king of the Franks, but he eventually, because of his success, was elevated to emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the West. And so that was really significant, and that made him very beloved among the Franks and the eventual French nation, since he was elevated to that position. Part of the reason he was elevated to that position was his military success, but also he converted many people to Christianity. Now keep in mind here when I say convert, it's much like we see at the end of the text here when you see that woman who's converted, the end of Song of Roland. It was often done forcefully through violence, manipulation. It was very much a part of the imperialism. And so Charlemagne was very successful at conquering all these territories, and in doing so, bringing people to Christianity. So that elevated him from king of just the Franks to king of the entire Holy Roman Empire in the West. So he became this legend in Frankish or French culture, not unlike King Arthur in English culture. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but he'd be a good comparison. One key difference is Charlemagne was an individual who actually lived, was actually a historical figure. It's just that because of his successes in French literature, he's taken on kind of a mythos that goes beyond what any one actual human being could do. He's become a legend, essentially, in French literature. So that's one significant aspect of this 8th century time period when the battle took place. And so he represents the ideal Christian king for the reasons I just said in the 8th century when the Holy Roman Empire is dominant in the West. Keep that in mind. We jump ahead to the 11th century, not when the text takes place, but when it is written. You have a different time period for Christianity. You have the emergence of the English and French nations out of these different tribes, and they're becoming Christian nations. And so you have a poem about this great Christian king, 300 years earlier, emerging at a time when the French nation is emerging, and it's emerging as a Christian nation. So in a time of high Christianity and a time of newly emerging Christianity, you have a text that straddles past and present, nostalgizes, idealizes Charlemagne as this Christian figure to kind of, transition, help transition the French nation into Western civilization, into the European world. So that's Charlemagne here is one example of how this text straddles past and present and uses past events that did actually happen, but very loosely adapts from those and puts a spin on those to make the text appealing to its 11th century audience. Very interesting relationship between past and present here. The other aspect of that, in addition to Charlemagne, is the depiction of the Muslim characters. As I mentioned before, the Muslim characters are very one-dimensional and mainly there to fulfill a purpose rather than be fully fleshed out characters that are integral to the story. They're more integral to the ideology of the text than the narrative of the text. So the battle that took place in the 8th century, again, was a real battle, and it was the last battle of a very successful campaign between the Franks and these kind of local inhabitants in Spain. The difference is these local inhabitants they fought were not Saracen Muslims. They were some other group. I don't have their name listed on the PowerPoint. You can look it up in the introduction to Song of Roland in the textbook. I should have put it on the PowerPoint, but they were not Muslims. So that was specifically changed to make this battle seem more like a crusade and bring that conflict between Christian and Muslim, East and West, into the poem. Why would they do this? Well, 11th century, the Crusades are at their height. The tension between Christians and Muslims is at a height too. They need soldiers to fight in the Crusades, so they create a text that glorifies that conflict, that essentially says the message of the text in one sense could be perceived as, hey, the Crusades are a good thing. This text has actually been used as political propaganda at various points throughout history because it has such an overt message of which side to choose here, and it certainly at the time was used to kind of inspire people to join in the Crusades. So they play with history a little bit. Now that can make it very easy to dismiss this text, and I would caution against that. We live in a time where films and books are marketed by a phrase that says based on a true story. And publishers and studios know that that phrase will sell copies and put people in theater seats. But I think all of us probably question a little bit, well, how accurate is this? And even though we do that, I do also see a popular trend of people kind of dismissing things. If it's not historically accurate enough, when it's a historical fiction, they dismiss it. But I think that's an ineffective barometer to evaluate texts. I see all texts as literary, as potentially fiction. And if we consider all texts, both texts that claim to be fiction, nonfiction, historical fiction, etc., as literature, and instead of looking at them and saying, how historically accurate is this, we say, what can we learn about the time and the culture from this text? I think that's a much more effective strategy. So Song of Roland is historical fiction, which makes it very interesting to read, but it plays fast and loose with history at the same time. So we can't read this text and learn much about Muslims from the 11th century or the 8th century, but we can read this text and learn a great deal about Christians from the 8th and 11th centuries. So I mentioned the same kind of thing about the barrier between fiction and reality, or fiction and history, and how that should really be collapsed in our studies. Going back to the first lesson with the Iliad, in addition to the Iliad, this is a text that also really bears out the breaking down of that barrier. Is it history? Is it literature? Well, it's some of both. Let's look at it as literature, but treat it somewhat like history in the way we learn about the past from it. So, turning to our reading questions now. With the reading questions, I try to always give you two major ideas that are like driving forces of the text, central themes, central issues, so that you can use those things as kind of like a central point to draw everything back to as you read kind of help you flesh out your understanding of the text. The first one is the medieval code of chivalry. We already talked a little bit about this when we were doing the recall, and we were talking about the vizier's loyalty to the king in the 1001 Nights. Here you see this played out even more. As I said, it's a driving force of the text. Chivalry was a code of conduct, essentially how a knight during the Middle Ages should conduct himself in battle. And he was supposed to be very noble, very respectful. In actuality, I'm sure knights did plenty of things that would go against their code. But the code was specifically tied to the hierarchical society. As I mentioned before, people believed the higher up one was in society, the closer that individual was to God. So the king was the closest to God. The nobility were somewhat closer to God, etc. So almost anyone could become a knight. And if they went through all the training, mentoring, etc., successful and became a knight, they took a vow and they pledged themselves to their noble or king. And in doing so, they all of a sudden went from whatever position they held before in society to being nobility. Kind of the lowest end of the nobility, but still nobility rather than commoner. And so they felt they were then subsequently closer to God. But that entailed being incredibly loyal to their king. Loyalty was a value prized above almost anything else during the Middle Ages. So you see this in the vizier's loyalty to the king in 1001 Nights. But here, you really see this in Song of Roland. It's, as I said, the driving force of the text. This text is based on a binary between loyalty and betrayal. And you see how loyal Roland is, how loyal Oliver is, but in a different way, and how disloyal Ganelon is, how deceitful the Muslims are to further the text's mission of kind of justifying the Crusades. And so, as I mentioned before, the Crusades were really like land wars, resource wars, more so than religious wars. But they were fought under this religious message to inspire people to be involved in them. And the code of chivalry was used in that way too. So, a knight might wipe out a village of innocents, but as knights were portrayed in text, in literary text, rather than in reality, they are portrayed as these idealized figures who followed this very noble code and pledged their loyalty to their king. So, the need for soldiers of the crusade helped create, or helped further at least, the code of chivalry, because they needed soldiers. Anyone could become a knight if they made it through all the training, and they would be desired to because they could become nobility, become closer to God. So the religious aspect of the Crusades was more to recruit soldiers through literary texts like Song of Roland than to, actually fight for a religious purpose. And the wars themselves were based more around land and resources. So that's why chivalry is a central theme here. And think about the different ways it manifests. 1001 Nights, betrayal is a central theme. As I mentioned a minute ago, betrayal is kind of like the binary, the opposite of loyalty here. And we see this in 1001 Nights, right? The king's wife betrays him, so he becomes corrupt, starts marrying a different woman every night and killing her. The next day, most of the characters in the stories are commit acts of betrayal, and Scheherazade uses their responses, those characters' responses to the betrayals, to try to teach the king how to handle things better and become a good king again. So betrayal, because loyalty, code of chivalry was so important all throughout the Middle Ages, kind of as the binary to that, betrayal was also an incredibly important theme. And you could say that betrayal is even more important in Song of Roland than it is in 1001 Nights. I mean, it's pretty important in both, but it's just so at the forefront of Song of Roland. We see Ganelon's betrayal as well as the betrayal of the Muslims, and betrayal is seen as like the ultimate sin here. That's certainly probably not true for Christians today, but we're living in a very different time period now. And then, to ensure loyalty, betrayal was seen as kind of like the cardinal sin by many. So keep these two themes in mind, chivalry/loyalty, and then as its opposite, betrayal, as we go through the text and the questions here. Looking at the text of the Song of Roland, I ask you, what kind of a protagonist is Roland? He's basically the kind of protagonist we just described. He is the ideal knight. He is loyal to his king to a fault. He lacks the psychology and the complexity of most of the characters we've seen so far, because he's more putting forth an idea than really being a character. And that idea is very much what we just described in talking about chivalry and knighthood, loyal to a fault. Oliver, on the other hand, Roland's best friend, is his foil or his opposite. And so Oliver is a more complex, more interesting character. And the text says Roland is good and Oliver is wise. Roland demonstrates the type of allegiance a knight should have to his king, and the text wanted to promote that kind of allegiance. But Oliver represents a more rational perspective. The key scene here that delineates this about the two characters is when they're charging over the pass of Roncesvalles, and they get ambushed by the Muslims, and they see the Muslims charging, and they debate calling for help. Roland believes calling for help would be cowardly, but Oliver, sizing up the battle accurately, knows that they can't win unless they call in reinforcements. And so Roland, I think, perhaps believes that they can win, even if it's a long shot. And if they don't, he believes that dying gloriously for his king would bring his king more honor and glory, rather than showing perhaps weakness or cowardice by calling in reinforcements. Oliver, on the other hand, believes if the troop can survive through reinforcements and win a battle, then that would subsequently bring glory to the king. So you can see these two perspectives here, how, in a sense, they're both right, which we've seen before, say, in texts like Antigone. But if you think about 21st century perspective, we're probably all thinking rationally, logically, Oliver's clearly right here. If you can win with reinforcements, call in reinforcements. Don't sacrifice yourself when you could win with just a little help. And it takes a big man to ask for help. But that's a 21st century perspective. I think at the time, the poet here, the author, is very clever. This is an anonymous poem, so we don't know the name of the poet or poets. But the author here, the poet, I think is pretty clever. He's aware that Oliver is more more intelligent, and delineates that clearly, but still at the same time, since Roland is good, Oliver is wise. Roland shows the kind of loyalty one should have at the time in pledging oneself to their king. So the author sets it up in a way that the rational reader kind of sees what Oliver is saying, and we do have that position where it's not that Roland is unquestioned, but that when he is questioned, we have the opportunity for his loyalty to kind of supersede over even being rational. And so it's a very interesting dichotomy. It's not easily resolvable, but we can see how the author would want to use it to inspire more people to join in the Crusades and pledge themselves to their kings and follow the code of chivalry. The plot of Song of Roland is really twofold, and this relates to kind of the opposite of what we just talked about with betrayal. If Roland is super loyal and Oliver sees himself as also being loyal, they experience betrayal at the same time, and this reinforces the significance of Roland and Oliver's loyalty. So the betrayal happens on two levels, one national and one personal. On the national level, the Muslims, they pretend to be surrendering, pretend to be willing to become Christian, and their king, Marsilian, says he'll convert to Christianity and go back with the Franks to France. And it's just a lie so that the French will leave and that they can ambush specifically Roland's troop from the large French army, which is his troop is in the rear at this point as they're going over the pass of Roncesvalles. So on a national level, the Muslims make kind of this fake treaty with the French and then betray them. And then on a personal level, Ganelon betrays Roland. Ganelon is Roland's stepfather and the king Charlemagne's brother-in-law. He's married Roland's mom, who is King Charlemagne's sister, so Roland is King Charlemagne's nephew. And so Ganelon is enmeshed in this royal family that's kind of at the top of the hierarchy by marrying Roland's mom recently. And that puts him in a very cumbersome position. Roland is this great soldier who's getting all this glory in battle, and Ganelon is feeling a little insecure, a little jealous about that. And then, when Marsilian, the Muslim king, hatches his plot to pretend to surrender and sends an emissary to contact the French and make his offer, the French then have to send an emissary back to say whether they accept that offer or not. And Roland volunteers Ganelon, which Ganelon immediately feels awkward about, put on the spot, right? This is very dangerous. The Muslims could be deceitful, and they actually are, so he could die. And so he gets very upset about this. It's kind of a prideful moment for both he and Roland. And so when he does arrive there and does speak to Marsilian, the Muslim king, he also betrays them. He betrays Roland, and he betrays Charlemagne. He helps the Muslim hatch their plan to ambush them while they're moving out of the country, and he specifically arranges it, kind of goads Roland's pride into Roland taking up the rear guard so that Roland will be in the part of the army that gets killed. The Muslims know they can't win the war, that it's over essentially, but they want the French to leave so that it will really be over, since they can't defeat them at this point, but they want to do it in a way that will let them strike one last blow by wiping out 1,000 or so men. And so Ganelon helps them do this, and in doing so ensures that Roland will be part of that group to get his revenge. So you have the two betrayals: national, Muslims betraying the French; personal, Ganelon betraying Roland and Charlemagne. After the battle plays out and we see Roland and Oliver defeated, very nobly as they fight and they're outnumbered, the poem ends with Ganelon's trial for treason. And this is a really interesting moment because the tribunal here initially decides not to put Ganelon to death. He was in a way defending his honor, although a better way to do it would have been to stand up and duel Roland when Roland nominated him to be the emissary of the Muslims. So he takes his vengeance and defends his honor in kind of a petty, deceitful way. But he is defending his honor, and what he does bring about the end of the war and less death overall, not unlike Odysseus' use of the Trojan horse to end the Greek war with the Trojans in the Iliad. So they decide not to put him to death. But then one man stands up and says, yes, he should be put to death. And this is the ultimate example of medieval justice. The reason why they decide not to put him to death after that man stands up is what the man says is that Ganelon, in betraying Roland, subsequently betrayed his king, and that is the greatest sin because that's like betraying God during the medieval time. And so they have this man duel one of Ganelon's retainers, and they believe that violence and duels are one of the best ways to settle things during the Middle Ages because whoever wins must have God on their side was the reasoning. And so this man who says, no, Ganelon betrayed his king. He betrayed Roland, his king, and subsequently God. Again, that hierarchy through chivalry. He must be put to death. He can't be spared. That man duels one of Ganelon's retainers. He wins, and Ganelon is put to death. So through Roland and Oliver in their loyalty, the poem shows kind of the ultimate example of chivalry, and that could inspire people to join the Crusades at the time. And then through Ganelon, his deceit, his treachery, as well as the deceit and the treachery of the Muslims, the poem, excuse me, I don't know why I keep saying that, shows the binary to loyalty in terms of betrayal, and ensures that, even more people will join the code of chivalry, join the war effort in the Crusades for those reasons too. And that, I would say, is the gist of the text, that juxtaposition there to further that message of kind of promoting the Crusades. Western civilization from what I just talked about. If you want to look in more in depth at the scenes I just talked about, I have two great passages here that talk about the difference between Roland and Oliver and their loyalty on the battlefield, and then two passages that deal with Ganelon's trial. And we'll finish out here with the questions for you to consider for the discussion board. We've already talked about the representation of Muslims and how that furthers the imperial mission. I'd love to see discuss that in more detail. This is a much more violent text. All the texts we've looked at have had a lot of battles and bloodshed, but especially the Greek texts had a lot of words and then very brief battles. Here we see a lot of the actual violence. So the medieval culture was a time when the theatricality of violence was very important in the media and in literature. We've talked about the importance of duels and how a duel would decide an important decision because it would reveal to the medieval audience who had God on their side. But what are some other examples of violence? Why do you think violence, kind of rose to popularity during this time? I think a compare and contrast with Song of Roland and Antigone would be great. Because you see treason in both texts, but it's portrayed very differently. Betrayal isn't nearly as strong of a theme there. I have a lot more I could say about that one, but I'd love to see what you can explore with it. And then I already talked about the significance of Charlemagne's character. We're reading this text rather than the British texts from the medieval period because there's a good chance you'd get a lot of those in your other classes. French literature, literature other than British and American literature is not taught nearly as much at university. So I'm trying to give you, the limited time we have and the large textbook we have, I'm trying to give you as much diversity as I can. But Charlemagne, even though he was a real person, his legend in French literature has become much like King Arthur. And so if you're trying to understand chivalry, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table would be kind of a good equivalent here for Charlemagne and his loyal knights, Oliver, Roland, and initially Ganelon, among the other examples from the text. So you could explore that more as well. I hope you enjoyed reading Song of Roland. It's a difficult text because it has a very overt political message that, looking back, we can kind of say, well, that seems pretty awful in terms of furthering imperialism and how it's depicting, non-Western cultures. But at the same time, it's a text that contributes significantly to the emergence of Western civilization, and to truly understand the history of Western civilization, it's a text we should read for those reasons. And it has plenty of interesting and fascinating elements despite some of the more unsavory ones too. So I hope you enjoyed reading it and have learned a little more about history now.